Article 2, Section 2 of the American Constitution states that the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. While this delegation of authority seems expansive, the Constitution checks this in Article 1, Section 8, which provides that only Congress can formally declare war and raise and support an army, and Section 9, which grants Congress the power of the purse and therefore to control war funding.
Presidents are also checked by the War Powers Act and the requirement to alert congressional intelligence committees of planned covert actions. The War Powers Act has not significantly limited the power of the presidency, however, because every president since its enactment in 1973 has ignored it and deemed it unconstitutional.
Some might say that the president has less direct military power than other chiefs of state. For example, in both 1914 and 1939, England was appalled when Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt were unable to commit to an alliance with England against Germany and had to await subsequent events which drew them into an alliance. That being said, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States has enormous power. Only 5 of 13 major wars in American history have followed a formal congressional declaration of war, and presidents have sent troops into foreign lands over 125 times on their own authorities. Additionally, presidents tend to receive more congressional support with regard to foreign policy issues than on domestic issues.
History shows us that presidents have been granted even broader powers during wartime. In World War I, for example, Woodrow Wilson rationed food and other items and controlled the news with public cooperation.
Under Truman in 1947, the National Security Act created the National Security Council, in which the president meets with a group of advisors to discuss security and foreign policy.
By law, the Secretaries of State and Defense and the Vice President must attend these meetings, but regular attendees also include the Secretary of the Treasury, the Attorney General, and other senior officials.
George W. Bush entered the White House with little foreign affairs experience. He was governor of Texas for the 6 years leading up to his victory in the 2000 presidential election.
Bush actually had very little foreign policy experience, aside from watching his father during George H.W. Bush's presidency. As governor, he dealt with mainly domestic issues, including faith-based welfare reform, education, criminal justice reform, and alternative energy solutions.
During his first 7 months as president, George W. Bush had no need to exercise his responsibility as Commander-in-Chief. Instead, he focused on passing the 2001 Bush tax cuts. After September 11, 2001, his foreign policy knowledge was put to test in deciding how to respond to terrorist attacks of al-Qaeda.
I went from a president that was, dealing with the tax cuts and education reform to one that still dealt with the economy, obviously, and domestic policy, but one of which my presidency has been, is a major emphasis has been our troops who have been in combat to protect the country.
Congress passed the Joint Resolution Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists on September 14, 2001, which allowed the President to fight terrorists and nations harboring terrorists. This joint resolution had the power of law. This showed congressional consent to President Bush to send forces into Afghanistan.
The war in Afghanistan, also known as the War on Terror, began on October 7, 2001, when American and British forces began bombing Taliban and al-Qaeda training camps, and American special forces sent ground troops into Afghanistan. Bush's approval rating rose to 90% after his quick response to the 9/11 attacks and his decision to fight the terrorist groups in the Middle East. The goals of the war in Afghanistan were to remove the Taliban from power, defeat al-Qaeda and the terrorists associated with it, and protect American interests at home and abroad. When the Taliban fled from the Afghan capital of Kabul on November 12, 2001, and withdrew to the mountainous border of Afghanistan with Pakistan, the United States supported a new government led by President Hamid Karzai. American forces were sent to Afghanistan to support this installed government and fight the Taliban in remote Afghan caves and mountains. From January to June 2008, Bush sent over 20,000 additional troops to Afghanistan, leading to a total of over 48,000 troops, before withdrawing over 8,000 troops from Iraq and 4,500 troops from Afghanistan in September. President Bush left office with this war ongoing. In 2003, President Bush declared war on Iraq. The October 2002 Congressional Joint Resolution to authorize the use of United States armed forces against Iraq allowed the president to quote-unquote use any means necessary to ensure the safety of Americans after the supposed discovery of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Iraq had been under a global microscope since 1990, when world leaders began to worry about Saddam Hussein's development of weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration focused more on Saddam Hussein's regime after the 9/11 attacks.
In 2003, President Bush gave a televised speech in which he told the public that there was strong evidence showing that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that if Saddam Hussein did not leave Iraq, United States military would invade and remove him from power. American forces entered Iraq on March 20th, 2003, and Bush declared victory on May 1st with his mission accomplished speech. Though Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party had been removed from power within 3 weeks of the March 20th invasion, Saddam Hussein was still at large until his capture on December 13th, where he was found in a hole near Tikrit, Iraq. After being tried by the Iraqi interim government, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity and was hanged on December 30th, 2006. Bush called for a United States troop insurgency in January 2007.
This will require increasing American force levels. So I've committed more than 20,000 additional American troops to Iraq.
American troops did not leave Iraq until December 2011 under the Obama administration. The weapons of mass destruction that were assumed to be in Iraqi possession were not present, and the development of them had stopped in 1991. Colin Powell, Secretary of State at the time, was a strong proponent of invading Iraq, though he later admitted to being sent inconclusive and inaccurate intelligence.
Sustaining the military was a significant aspect of George W. Bush's presidency. With the combined wars and other military efforts, he brought military spending to heights that hadn't been reached since Reagan. In 2007, for example, Bush's defense budget request was over $480 billion. From 2001 to 2006, he spent a total of $660 billion between the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Guantanamo Bay Prison is an American military facility in Cuba established in 1903. The Bush administration began using it in 2002 as a central prison of those suspected of being enemy combatants in the war in Afghanistan following 9/11 and, later, the war in Iraq.
Guantanamo Bay became globally criticized because of the known torture techniques going on, including severe sleep deprivation, waterboarding, humiliation techniques, and more.
In the Hamdan v. Rumsfeld Supreme Court case, the Bush administration claimed that the protections in the Geneva Conventions did not apply to detainees at Guantanamo Bay, to which the Supreme Court ruled that the detainees should at least be provided the protections under Common Article 3, which includes the provision that no one should be tortured. Susan J. Crawford, under Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, was the first person in the Bush administration to admit that torture took place at Guantanamo Bay.
So, under President George W. Bush, the United States became involved in two wars, the war on terror in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And neither of these wars was declared by Congress. So, George W. Bush definitely exemplified an imperial president because he got the United States involved in these wars, and constitutionally the power to not only declare war but also to fund troops and such is given to Congress.
Yeah, and going along with that, I think he's definitely an imperial president in terms of chief party leader, because that's not even really a formally outlined power in the Constitution. You look through the Constitution and there really is nothing said about chief party leader, showing that the founders didn't intend for that even to be a position. And now, look how it's grown. I mean, there's technology for the president to be able to campaign and show all his beliefs, that being a party leader is such a major part of being president that I think he's really taken that role and become a very imperial president.
Yeah, and along the same lines with the chief executive, Bush was definitely an imperial president. He made great use of the executive orders. So executive orders are not formally in the Constitution, and they've just become assumed. And with FDR, presidents have just used more and more of them within their presidency. And Bush put them to great use within the two wars that he was fighting during his presidency. And you can see this through his executive orders that he issued through declaring anyone a lawful enemy combatant, so he could literally strip any American citizens of their rights, and they don't even know why. They don't get a trial or a say. And that shows he has great power. And he also outlined torture laws, which shows that he has a great say, and also military, and how we treat enemies of war.
In Guantanamo Bay, yeah.
So I think we have reached a pretty unanimous decision that George W. Bush was definitely an imperial president, as with, most presidents of modern times. So he was an imperial president.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed our segment today. Join us next time for another episode of The Presidency.